Okay, so our very first session is on fundraising myths. So we're going to be debunking the most popular myths, the most frequent myths that founders who are new to fundraising might have. But before we do that, we want to say hello and welcome. Again, if you have not already introduced yourself in the chat, please do. In the sign-up forms, so many of you noted that one of the main things that you were looking forward to and over the next week was meeting the peer group. And so obviously this is a virtual program and we're going to do everything possible to make sure you guys meet each other throughout the next 5 days, especially in the peer groups on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. But being active in the chat is like a great way to get to know each other at the start. Okay, so let's jump into the first 2 myths. Actually, before that, does anyone have any, like, what's a belief that you have about fundraising? Are you worried it's going to be hard? Do you think you need to know a lot of investors? Do you feel like you need to be generating revenue? Any sort of beliefs that you have, put them in the chat. I say that as I just realized that as I'm on present mode, I can't see anything in the chat, which is just a very inconvenient part of Zoom. I just realized. So Purdy, if anything comes up, let me know.
Yeah, we'll do.
Okay.
Just intros at the moment. But whilst I am speaking, I've just put a link in for everyone to join the WhatsApp group. So we have a cohort WhatsApp group where you can just ask informal questions. We'll also share any other reading. We'll share recordings via WhatsApp as well. And then we're running peer-to-peer groups, which Emma just mentioned. There's a bunch of people that have already signed up. You've already been allocated to a peer-to-peer group. If you're interested in joining a peer group, but you haven't yet signed up, I just posted a link in the chat. I'll do so again. We're going to break off into groups of 5 or 6 founders, so you get to know a smaller group better on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays for an hour, just to chat about best practice or to share any challenges that you've got. Peer groups are not mandatory. So if you do not want to join or you can't make the time, that is absolutely fine. They'll run from 11:30 till 12:30, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday.
So, okay. Now, before we dive into these first 2 myths, a few disclaimers. Number 1, you're probably going to end this session being slightly more confused than how we started it, which is not the ideal way to start a 30-minute session on the very first day, but it's going to tee you up really well for the rest of the week. So bear with me for the next like 30 minutes, and over the next 30 minutes or 20-ish minutes or so, jot down a lot of notes. These slides, you'll notice, are pretty text light, and so I want you to write down any key takeaways from the notes, but also anything that you're confused about, because I want to make sure that by Friday you have all of those terms or strategies that we talk about. Anything that you're confused about, we've covered it. The startup book that you've been sent in your email is going to cover a lot of the terminology that might be a little bit confusing. We know that some people are brand new to the startup journey. A few of you have already raised a little bit of money, and so we have a different starting point for people, but want to make sure all of you end Friday feeling really comfortable. Okay, so with that, myth 1 and myth 2. Number 1, I need to have a perfectly developed product before I speak with investors. And myth 2, I need investment to start developing my product. So probably notice they're polar opposite beliefs, but we hear them all the time from founders. But rather than talking about what you don't need, I want to talk about what you do need. But before that, there's kind of 3 things to consider before we talk about what you need. Number 1, your network. Are you starting to raise from a place where you already know a lot of the angel investors? Number 2, do you have a track record that would get investors really excited? So have you formerly been the former chief product officer at Revolut right when they started? Or have you built and sold a successful startup before? Things like that. And then number 3 is going to be your experience. So even if you haven't had any startup experience, if you have decades long building X, Y, and Z at a large corporate, and now you're doing that as a startup, those can really serve in your favor. If you don't have any of those, do not worry. The more founders than not that we've worked with, maybe tick one of the boxes, but also don't tick any, and they're able to raise. But those are kind of the 3 things to keep in mind as I talk about what you do want to have when you go to fundraise. So what you do want to have when you go to fundraise, and these are important bullet points to note down. Number 1, you want to have a clear problem that you're trying to solve, and you want to have proof that that problem exists and is painful. Number 2, you want to have either users or customers who would be willing to pay for that solution. Number three, this should probably be number two. You want to have proof from those users or from those customers that that solution is the right solution to the problem they're having. And then fourth and final point is you want to ideally have a large market size. So you want to have a lot of users or a lot of customers who have this problem. And we're going to cover throughout the week ways that you can measure all of that. But if you're able to demonstrate that to investors, that's going to help you. If you don't have a product, if you don't have a track record, if you don't know any of investors, that's kind of like a really good foundation. And once you're able to tick those boxes, then you're ready to go out and speak with investors. Now, in order to do that, you might need to build a cheap, not ideal version of an MVP. You might need to do a lot of customer research and be able to approach investors and say, I know this is a problem because I spoke with 500 potential customers or potential users. They took this survey. Here are the results. There's so many ways that you can tick those boxes, but those are the main things to concentrate on. Okay, let's go on to myth number three. Myth number three, I need to know investors. And to be honest, it's not entirely a myth. Obviously, it is a huge asset if you're starting your fundraising game already knowing investors. However, if you don't, the main thing you want to focus on is trust. If you already know investors, the big advantage that you have is not necessarily that you know them, but that they trust you. Because if you know a lot of people and you know a lot of investors, but they don't trust you and they don't think very highly of you, it's probably going to do you more harm than good. However, if you're able to figure out other ways to get investors to trust you faster and to kind of shorten that period of time that they need to know you in order to feel like they can make a decision, then that's going to serve you really well. Now, there's so many things that you can do to expedite that trust building process with investors. We'll cover some of those throughout the week. A really good place to start is by sending monthly updates to anyone who you think may be a possible angel investor for you. If you're thinking, I don't even know what an angel investor looks like, I don't know any, we're going to talk about that a bit more in the next session at 10:30. We have an angel investor coming in. He also runs a very active angel syndicate, and we'll cover that as well. But a good place can be to start with the trust building is with those monthly updates. So if you're planning to fundraise in 6 months, you can go ahead and add potential angel investors. Obviously, like, don't steal their email and just add them to the email list. You can do a cold outreach on LinkedIn, say, hey, I'm building this product, not fundraising right now, but I'm just curious to know if you're okay with me adding you to our monthly update. And then over the next 6 months, you're going to send them a monthly update of, here's what I did this month. Here are the KPIs I hit. Here's what went well. Here's what didn't. I could use help in this. And you send that out to your list, and then fast forward 6 months. And that person, even if you've never had an interaction with them or conversation, they can go back and see 6 months of your progress. And that's a really good tool that we've seen from a lot of founders to build that trust. Now, that was, as you probably noticed, like a 6-month period. So it's going to be really hard if you approach investors cold and you're trying to close the deal by the end of the week. But there are other hacks too that we'll cover. I don't really like the word hack. But there's other methods that you can use if you don't know any investors. So this myth is like partially debunked, partially true. Okay, next one. I need to have a perfectly calculated valuation. So good news, valuation is a confusing topic. We have an expert coming in on Friday, Anthony from Seed Legals, and he has a lot of data on startup valuation. So he's going to be able to give you those like exact benchmarks that is going to give you a lot of confidence around the valuation that you set. Valuation, the key thing to remember, is really more of an art rather than a specific science. Right now, you're probably too early to have any metrics and multiples to help you calculate a perfect valuation. Kind of the rough way to view it is you want to think about how much money you need to raise, and then you combine that with, okay, I'm raising a pre-seed round, and typically pre-seed round, I'm giving away 15 to 20% of my company. So let's say I need to raise 100K. So, okay, my valuation is now about 500K. Realistically, you will see most pre-seed rounds in the UK probably going somewhere between $1 million and 2.5 million. I would say that's a normal-ish range. But if you're new to valuations and it all feels really foreign, don't worry. By Friday, you'll feel more comfortable. One thing I do want to take a moment to define, because it can be a little confusing, is the difference between a pre-money and a post-money valuation. So a pre-money valuation is the valuation of the company, not including any investor dollars or pounds that you receive. A post-money valuation is the valuation after you receive that money. So if you're raising at, I don't know, let's say a 4 million pound valuation, and you're raising £1 million, if you included that 1 million into your valuation, you would say it's a pre-money, sorry, if you included it, it'd be post-money valuation. So it'd be a post-money valuation of 4 million. And so if investors put in 1 million, that means they own 25% of the company. If it's a pre-money valuation, that means it's 4 million, plus they put their additional million in, and now they own 20% of the company, because the valuation with the million goes up to 5 million. So that's really important to make sure that when you're setting your valuation, you just know when asked from investors, whether or not you're telling them it's your pre-money or post-money valuation. Okay. Myth 5. Oh no, the Zoom thing is covering my text. I can't see it. Okay, there we go. I need money to build, so investors should give me money. If only it worked like this, I wish. Unfortunately, fortunately for the investors need to see a strong case for their ROI in order to write that check. Now, the ROI looks a little different for VCs and for angels. VCs are going to be looking for you to do one thing and one thing only, and that is to become a unicorn. And the reason they need that is because, or the reason they wouldn't be happy with, like, let's say a 100 or 200 million pound exit, which most people would be pretty happy about if they sold their company for 100 million pounds, is that they're taking such a big risk on companies at such an early stage. And the vast majority of those companies, like about 80% of those companies, are entirely going to die. And if they're have, let's say, a 100 million pound fund or 500 million pound fund, and they have to return several multiples of that to their investors, with most of the investments that they're doing completely dying, that means the like handful of small companies that are still alive, about 60%, actually I think it's higher, but I think it's about 80% of the companies that aren't entirely dead just return the amount of money that the investors initially put into them. And then you have about 3 to 4 companies where the entire success of the VC fund depends on how well they do. And so in order for it to make sense, they have to think, yes, I believe this company has the potential to reach unicorn status. And they'll judge that a few different ways. They might judge that, it's different for different investors. They might judge it on market size, what makes you different from the competitors, how saturated the market is, the quality of the team. They have many different ways of assessing that. And then angels, on the other hand, are usually investing for 2 reasons. 1 is ROI, and 2 is purpose. And so for angel investors, you'll often see that perhaps their own personal passions, or their own interests, or their own just life experience. Maybe they've had a family member who's been sick, and so they're really inclined to give that deep tech company that doesn't look like they have a long shot of success. They're more inclined to give them money because it's like a personal cost to them, or that perhaps like climate or something like that. Although climate is a lot more popular now, but that you'll see investors, angels, be more inclined to like make passion-based, heart-based decisions, shall we say. But at the end of the day, whether it's a VC or an angel, you still need to prove to that investor that you are more likely to return them the money, the ROI that they want, than any other startup that they're seeing. And bear in mind, VCs are seeing thousands of decks per year, if not per month. Angel investors typically invest in 1% of all of the deals they come across. 90% of deals don't even make it past their first like filtering system checkpoint. And then on average, they spend about 10 hours on the deals that make it past that first checkpoint. And then on top of that, they're often they're often working full time. And so you need to make it as easy as possible for them to want to invest in you, essentially. Okay, next myth. I need to be technical or have a technical co-founder. Okay, also one that is not an entire myth. It is a massive advantage if you have one founder who's focused on like business and ops and another founder who's focused on the technical build. A big reason that that is an advantage is because investors want to see that you can launch a product and iterate super quickly. And so if you're able to have the talent in team, that means you can grow so much faster. If you're working with an agency or just a contractor, a third party, you're having to pay every single time that you make that iteration. And the likelihood of you launching with the perfect product that it doesn't need that you've drawn up the specs, you've passed it to the your engineering consulting agency, they've developed this perfect MVP, you launch it and it just goes amazingly. I don't think that's ever been done before. If that is done, I mean, that's not to say someone couldn't do it, but it is just a huge advantage for both the investors and their perspective, but also just mechanically from like the point of view of your startup, it's great if you have that talent inside. Now, if you don't have one, there's ways around it. And we know people who have used these ways around it and it's worked really well for them. Probably the best example would be the Olio founders. Neither of the founding team, the two founders, were technical. We've had Sasha come in and speak with our cohort a few times, and she's talked about how they worked. I believe they worked with an agency for their first iteration, and they were able to raise from a top tier VC fund. So it's not common, but it's also not possible. So the ways around it, if you're like, hey, this is me, I don't have a technical co-founder. Actually, if you want to raise your hand, if no one in your team is technical, that would be very useful. Oh no, I've changed it and I can't see you guys. Okay. So, okay, I see some hands raised. So if this is you and you don't have a technical co-founder, number one, let's cover the basics really quickly on, actually we'll cover this in the next slide. So I'll just stick to the tech part. Okay, so if you don't have a technical co-founder and you're not bringing one on, the things that you can do around this is number one, you can build an MVP with a no-code platform like Bubble. Downside of this, it is time intensive. You're not going to get the prettiest product if you don't have a background building a no-code product. And also you might need to pay an external source in order to be able to build it. The plus side of it is that while it's not easy, you can definitely learn. We built our MVP on Bubble. I paid a bit of money for an online coach, which helped a lot. If anyone needs that recommendation, happy to do that. And again, we did not end up with like the prettiest MVP. However, it was functional and it was able to like give us some of the key data that we needed and had like the core functionality that we needed. So that's an option. There are alternatives to Bubble as well. I won't go over those, but if you have questions about no-code platforms, let me know. Option number two is to work with a developer agency. So we have a couple that we know that we've heard good things about or that we've worked with for some in different capacities. And there are some who are great. There are also some who are really sharky. And if you don't know someone who's used them, it's really hard to tell the difference between the two. A few things to look out for is number one, pricing. We come across many agencies who claim to want to work with startups, and you'll chat with them and they'll tell you they'll spec it up and they understand, your startup, your limited budget, and then they'll write you a quote of like a couple $100K, which if you don't have investment, like just bottom line, do not spend a couple $100K building your MVP unless you're like a deep tech startup. But you'll want to try to find the agencies or the studios that work very frequently with startups. So if they have a huge portfolio of startups whose names you recognize, or maybe you might even find someone in the cohort has used an agency. Actually, if you have used an agency before, I'd love for you to put it in the chat, or if you're considering using an agency, put it in the chat, because it's definitely something you're going to want to get feedback on. I would recommend asking for references. So reach out to the founders. You could either ask them to put you in touch with startups they've worked with, or you can go ahead and just like try to contact a founder whose portfolio name you see online and just try to contact them on LinkedIn and ask. Because what you want to look out for are the agencies that put on a bunch of contingencies. So let's say you launch a product and you need to iterate a few things, and maybe you've agreed that they're going to do a few different iterations, but they come back and they're trying to charge you like tens of thousands of pounds. Or if you're not technical, it's really easy for someone to take advantage of that and say, oh, it's going to take so much more time than you thought, so it's going to be more expensive, blah, blah, blah. So a good way around that too is by finding, so I'm just checking on timing. Okay, we're good on time. A good way around that as well is to find a consulting CTO. So a consulting CTO is going to kind of sit between you and the developers, but they're going to be a bit more of kind of like a fractional team member. So they'll understand more of the strategy for your business. And most of the time, they have a really good network of developers who they've worked with and trusted. And we've heard more positive reviews of, I would say, consulting CTOs or fractional CTOs than agencies. And they're usually very, very familiar with the nuances and challenges of building as a startup. So that's a good place to start as well. Okay. Next slide. And this is the final myth. I can't be a solo founder. So again, this is not entirely a myth. However, it's doable if you are a solo founder. If you're a solo founder, raise your hand. Oh, I mean, sorry, wait, raise your Zoom hand because I can't see all your wonderful faces. Okay. So for solo founders, you're probably going to hear from investors, I only invest in co-founders. I don't invest in solo founders. Ooh, we got a lot of solo founders in here. Good news, about 20% of all unicorns were actually built by solo founders. And so, yes, that does suggest the majority, the 80% were built by a team. However, the number one reason that startups fall apart is co-founder disagreement. And so you could also flip it and say, hey, we're avoiding the number one reason that startups fall apart. And so there's going to be pluses and minuses. You may consider bringing on a co-founder at some point. If you are, I highly suggest we have a section in the startup guide. Read over that because there are certain things that you'll want to do ahead of time to protect both you and your startup, especially when you're in that kind of few month trial phase of bringing in a co-founder. But back to those who are kind of sticking with the solo founder game. Again, yes, you will get pushback from investors. A lot of time when you get pushback from investors, they're not necessarily saying things that you have to follow just because they're asking you, hey, why don't you have this? Most of the time you'll find they're kind of just prodding you because they want to better understand your thinking and your strategy behind things. So if you're able to say, I'm being a solo founder, I have X years of experience, or I've already recruited these 3 people who have loads of experience, who understand my blind spots, who are going to join us after we close the round. You'll just want to show them that you've thought about the blind spots that they're seeing and the risks involved that they're seeing. The other concern, which is not that lovely to say, but it's also in the back of investors' minds, is, hey, what happens if I give this founder 100K or 200K and then they get hit by a bus tomorrow? Or they decide that they don't want to work in the startup anymore, or they have a visa problem, they have to leave the country, they can't build the startup anymore. It increases their risk. And so always think from the investor's risk point of view. What red flags am I sending out? And how can I counteract that? Whether that be explicitly and saying, hey, I know you're probably thinking X, Y, and Z, here's how I'm thinking it. Or if you want to do it more subtly and just kind of emphasize those details throughout your pitch as well. But yeah, those are important notes to have before you start your fundraising process. Okay, and also just before you start conversations with investors as well. So your takeaways. Oh, by the way, I didn't say this, but I should have. If you guys have any questions, I can't tell if any questions are coming in the chat. But if you have questions, please ask. We can cover it now. We can cover it later. We have an hour session started with it. Again, in just a minute, but we can try to get through a few if any come in. So these are a few key takeaways. We'll share the slide deck with you guys as well. So number 1, show investors passion, progress, and potential. So that is going back to kind of the 4 things that you want to show investors, which is like your problem, your how significant the problem is, how many people experience it, and the fact that people are willing to pay. 2 is, yes, there are ways around having a network of angel investors. So having your fundraising strategy set and taking action on that is going to be more advantageous than just coming in with a network. 3, evaluation is an art, not a science. 4, think 5 steps ahead always. 5, show the ROI. 6, there are more than one way to do things. And 7 is 2 is better than 1 most of the time. Or 3, if you're beyond 3 co-founders, you're going to be too diluted and it's not always ideal. Okay, so those are some general principles. If you are feeling confused, worried, or stressed right now, don't stress, because by the end of the week, you guys are going to be feeling great, or hopefully better and less confused than you might right now. Okay, I'm going to check the chat quick to see if there's any questions. If not, I think Agan has just arrived, but we'll pause if any of you guys want to raise your hand for anything.